Chapter 1. The Rain That Stopped for 1 Minute. The rain fell with the relentlessness of a metronome, striking the terraced stones of the Rosemore estate with an even, unceasing rhythm. A silvery curtain draped over the hills beyond, concealing the village of Windermere Hollow in a veil of autumnal melancholy. The manor loomed like a ship adrift in storm, its high gables and tall windows flickering with the occasional candlelight of guests trying to ignore the grimness outside. At precisely 7:14 p.m., the rain stopped. Not lessened, not slowed. Stopped. For exactly 1 minute, as though some invisible hand had raised the needle from a gramophone, silencing nature's accompaniment. It was the silence that drew their attention. The sudden absence of sound felt unnatural, like a room where a clock had stopped ticking mid-sentence. In the parlour, Lady Helena Rosemore looked up from her embroidery. In the hallway, the butler paused as he carried a tray of coffee. On the stair, a young woman named Beatrice Lockwood dropped her book and held her breath. A grandfather clock gave a single hollow chime. Then, as if exhaling, the rain returned, steady, cold and indifferent. By 7:20 p.m., the body had been found. It was Lord Percival Rosemore. He lay sprawled on the study carpet, an overturned glass near his right hand. His left hand tucked awkwardly beneath his chest as though he had been trying to grasp at something unseen. His face was oddly peaceful, but it was the eyes, wide open, staring at the polished ceiling, that gave the game away. Something had taken him by surprise in the very moment of death. Dr. William Hartley, summoned immediately, crouched beside the corpse and pressed 2 fingers to the throat. "He's gone," he said flatly. "Not long, less than 15 minutes, I should say." "Poison?" asked Lady Helena in a voice too controlled. Dr. Hartley's brow furrowed. "There's no smell, no sign of struggle, but I won't rule it out. It could be a fast-acting alkaloid, strychnine, perhaps." "I see." She straightened, smoothing the front of her gown. "We should notify the authorities, and there's someone else who must be told." Beatrice Lockwood, still at the foot of the stairs, whispered, "You mean the man Lady Helena brought in this afternoon?" "Yes," said Lady Helena, almost to herself. "The Belgian." Hercule Poirot was not, as many imagined, the sort of man who faded into the background. Though he was not tall, and though his shoes were so pristine that no English lane dared muddy them, his presence expanded to fill any space. He was the sort of man whose silence spoke louder than others' opinions. He had arrived at Rosemore that very afternoon, having accepted Lady Helena's rather cryptic invitation. She had written that she feared something intolerable is growing in this house. Not something of the flesh, but of the will. Poirot had smiled gently at the phrase. "A crime of psychology." "Then," he had said aloud in his compartment as the train curved toward the south. "Ah, but of course." Now, as he was summoned by the footman to the study, Poirot appeared in the doorway with a slight bow. He was dressed immaculately, as though the storm had not touched him. Grey 3-piece suit, gloves, and a pocket square as crisp as a pressed envelope. He examined the scene without kneeling, his gaze flicking from the position of the body to the still swaying decanter on the table, to the singular detail others had not yet considered. The window latch opened just an inch, letting in the scent of petrichor and distant smoke. Lady Helena approached him. "Monsieur Poirot, I did not expect your services would be required so soon." Poirot's eyes remained on the decanter. "When death arrives too early, madame, it is rarely by accident. May I examine the room before anything is disturbed?" The constable, newly arrived, looked doubtful, but Lady Helena nodded. "Yes, please." Poirot moved like a dancer in a sacred ritual, hands clasped neatly, eyes missing nothing. He observed the stain around the mouth of the glass, the single muddy footprint not matching Lord Rosemore's shoes, the copy of Othello lying open on the floor, pages fluttering as though it had been thrown. "Do you know what chapter it is open to?" Poirot asked gently. Beatrice, who had edged into the room unnoticed, looked over. "Act 3, Scene 3. Oh, beware, my lord. Of jealousy." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, most instructive." By the time the rain truly subsided, this time for good, it was nearing midnight. The guests of the manor had been gathered in the drawing-room. They sat in various states of discomfort and anxiety. The tall French window showed only mist and moonlight now. Among the occupants, Lady Helena Rosemore, the poised widow whose grief seemed encased in marble. Dr. William Hartley, a family friend with tired eyes and a careful tongue. Beatrice Lockwood, the observant niece with ink-stained fingers and a quiet defiance. Julian Fay, Lord Rosemore's secretary, nervous and pale, clutching a sheaf of unsent letters. Charlotte Ambrose, Lady Helena's oldest friend, who sipped sherry with steady fingers. James Ambrose, her husband, whose watchful silence suggested he heard more than he said. Poirot stood before them, calm, precise. "Mesdames et messieurs, forgive the intrusion into your evening. A man has died, perhaps by fate, perhaps not. But there is something curious that occurred this evening, something nature herself betrayed. A silence in the rain. For 1 minute, it stopped. Only 1 minute. But that minute," he said softly, "was long enough for murder." They stared at him, unmoving. "I do not yet know the method. I do not yet know the name. But I tell you this. There is someone in this room who feared that minute more than anything." He bowed slightly and turned. "Now, I shall begin with the study." And with that, Hercule Poirot, master of the human soul, stepped once more into the web. The rain, still clinging to the windows like reluctant ghosts, watched in silence. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The study had been left untouched, save for the placement of a single white sheet over Lord Rosemore's body, now still beneath the dim light of the desk lamp. The scent of paper and aged wood mixed with the faint, acrid note of spilled brandy. Poirot entered alone this time, with the constable posted outside at his request. "Let the little grey cells work without interruption," he had said mildly. He circled the room slowly. Everything was as it had been, yet not. The decanter and glass sat on the mahogany side table, but Poirot noted again the slightly darker ring beneath the glass. Moisture, yes, but less condensation and more residue. He retrieved a handkerchief and dabbed gently, noting the slight discoloration on the cloth. Next, he examined the armchair across from the body. A copy of Othello still lay open, as it had before, but Poirot's eyes narrowed. A faint smudge of oil on the page edge suggested the book had been handled recently by someone whose hands had touched the decanter as well. He knelt, not easily, but carefully, before the fireplace. The ash was cold, but within it he saw the curled corner of what had once been a note, now charred black. Using tweezers from his pocket case, he extracted it, revealing one edge of surviving paper. 3 letters remained. L. Poirot murmured. "Perhaps will, or perhaps a label. Too little, too little." On the desk lay a sheaf of papers. Most bore Lord Rosemore's distinctive slanted hand. The top sheet was a typed letter, unsigned, unfinished. Poirot's eyes scanned the lines. "And while I cannot yet prove what I suspect, I shall not allow it to go further without..." Without what? A confrontation? A public accusation? He tucked the page into his case, then examined the blotting paper nearby. Turning it slightly against the light, he read faint mirrored words. "The inheritance." His brows lifted. "So we have suspicion. And money." Poirot straightened and turned his attention to the window. Still open, just an inch. A drop of water clung to the latch. Someone had opened it recently. perhaps to dispose of something or to allow something in. Yet no footprints marred the carpet below it. A neat room, too neat. He stood for a moment in stillness, eyes closed. Mon ami Hastings would call this a room of whispers, he said aloud to no one. Everything speaks, if you learn how to listen. Downstairs, the drawing room was no less tense than before. The guests had taken positions like players, waiting for the curtain to rise. Charlotte Ambrose tapped her rings against the side of her glass. Beatrice had a notepad in her lap, but the pencil hung idle. Julian Fay smoked one of Lord Rosemore's cigarettes with shaking fingers. Poirot entered like a silent gust. "I thank you all for your patience," he said. "There are small things, always small things, that tell us much. Lord Rosemore's glass was not poured by his own hand tonight. There is a trace of oil on a book he last touched. Othello, a tragedy of jealousy and revenge. A note was burned in the fireplace, though the room was otherwise so clean. And the window, mes amis, the window was opened recently. The room did not move. Someone came in, or something was meant to leave." James Ambrose finally spoke, voice low. "Are you suggesting someone entered the study from the garden in the middle of a downpour?" "No, monsieur. I'm suggesting they wanted us to think so." Poirot stepped closer to the fire, folding his hands behind his back. There is also mention of an inheritance. "Tell me, Lady Helena, was there to be a change in the will?" Lady Helena's lips parted, then closed again. She looked toward Dr. Hartley, who gave a small nod. "Yes," she said at last. Percival had planned to alter the distribution. Nothing formal had been filed, but he was considering removing certain secondary beneficiaries. He did not say who. Poirot inclined his head. "This too may be of interest." He turned toward Julian, whose cigarette had burned nearly to the filter. "Monsieur Fay, you handled Lord Rosemore's correspondence, yes?" Julian nodded. "Yes. He dictated letters. I typed them, filed them. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary." Poirot's eyes lingered. "You typed a letter today. It was left unsigned." Julian flinched. "That wasn't mine." "No?" Poirot arched an eyebrow. "Then someone else used your typewriter." I suppose so. It's kept in the small library, not locked." Poirot let that answer settle like dust. Later that night, Poirot took a solitary stroll through the back gallery, where portraits of past Rosemores stared down from their gilt frames with regal disapproval. Rain patted gently against the high windows now, no longer thunderous. A whisper of footsteps interrupted him. Beatrice Lockwood stood at the edge of the corridor, notebook in hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know it isn't proper, but I saw something." Poirot gave a small smile. "Mademoiselle, it is always proper to share what troubles the mind." She stepped forward. At dinner, Lord Rosemore was quiet, but he kept staring at the clock, as though waiting for something. And then, when the rain stopped, he stood suddenly. He muttered something. I couldn't hear it. "You remember the time?" "Yes. 7:14 exactly." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You are very precise, mademoiselle." "I like patterns," she said softly. "They keep the world from coming undone." Poirot bowed his head. "Then we are allies, you and I. For I, too, believe in patterns, and in that 1 minute when the world fell silent, I believe something came undone indeed." He looked back once toward the hallway behind them, to the study far beyond. Something had waited for that moment of silence, and now Poirot would begin to draw out the voice behind it. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Morning crept over Rosemore Estate reluctantly, grey and streaked with mist. The rain had finally stopped, but the wet earth still held the memory of the storm. From the drawing-room window, Poirot watched the garden paths glisten under a leaden sky, as though the landscape itself were still digesting the events of the night before. By 8 o'clock, he had already sent for each of the principal guests to gather once more in the parlour, this time not as mourners, but as persons of interest. It was a subtle change of tone, but they each sensed it. They entered in ones and twos, settling uneasily in the high-backed chairs and soft armchairs. Poirot stood near the fireplace, glancing toward the doorway as the final figure arrived. Lady Helena, draped in a severe black morning gown, sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression remained unreadable, though her eyes flicked just once toward the vacant hearth as if expecting her husband to reappear. Beside her sat Dr. William Hartley, rubbing his left temple with a thumb, fatigue etched into his features. "One death is enough to exhaust a man," he muttered when greeted. Charlotte Ambrose was already seated, sipping tea with mechanical elegance. "Tragedy," she declared softly, "tends to come when you're least inclined to dress for it." Her husband, James Ambrose, remained standing, arms crossed over his chest, eyes scanning everyone in turn. There was a subtle alertness in his gaze, an instinct sharpened by years in colonial administration. He did not trust easily, and now he trusted no one. Julian Fay arrived last, muttering apologies, his hair still damp from a too hasty wash. He clutched a folio of documents to his chest like a shield. Poirot watched him closely, and Beatrice Lockwood sat apart, quietly noting the scene in her ever-present notebook. Poirot stepped forward. "Mes amis, you have been gathered not merely because of your proximity to the late Lord Rosemore, but because, in my experience, a circle of such refinement may still contain within it a secret capable of murder." They bristled, some visibly, others inwardly. "Let us speak not of suspicion, but of opportunity and of motive. I shall ask only for honesty." Charlotte gave a brittle laugh. "Then we shall be here for some time." Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, honesty may be elusive, but inconsistency is not." He turned to Lady Helena. "Madame, you said your husband intended to alter his will. Can you recall when he first mentioned this?" She hesitated. "2 weeks ago. He had a conversation with his solicitor in London. I didn't know the details. He only said he wished to correct old obligations." "Old obligations," Poirot repeated. "That is a phrase with flexibility." Lady Helena said nothing more. Poirot turned his gaze to Julian Fay. "You were present in the house for much of that time, were you not?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot." "Did Lord Rosemore appear anxious? Distracted?" Julian shifted. "Yes, I suppose. He spent more time in the study. He asked me to draft several letters, and he shredded one of them afterward. Said it was too direct. He never let me read the final version." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "And did anyone else, other than you, have access to the study in the evening?" "Technically, no. It's always locked after 9, but—" Julian hesitated. "Yes. Beatrice sometimes goes in when he's not there." All eyes turned to her. Beatrice blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Only to borrow books. He said I could." "Books?" Charlotte Ambrose asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You read legal drafts, do you?" "No," Beatrice replied quietly. "Poetry and journals. He wrote notes in the margins, things he didn't say aloud." James Ambrose frowned. "You read his personal journals?" "I didn't snoop," she said. "They weren't hidden." Poirot held up a hand to quiet the sudden heat. "It is good to understand habits and access. Mademoiselle, did you happen to be in or near the study last evening before the body was discovered?" Beatrice met his eyes. "I passed by at 6:50. I heard raised voices inside. 2 people. One was Lord Rosemore. The other was male." Poirot leaned forward. "Can you identify the second voice?" "I don't know. It was low, angry. The door was closed." Poirot turned slowly. "Dr. Hartley." The physician looked up. I was with Lord Rosemore in the morning, but not later. I spent most of the afternoon reviewing patient notes. Were you alone? No. James Ambrose and I played a game of chess before dinner. He can confirm. James nodded once. He did. Poirot let the silence settle. Then he turned back to Beatrice. What did you hear? She closed her eyes, recalling. Something about not forgiving this one, and don't think I won't do it again. A silence fell. Poirot watched each face, registering the reactions. Lady Helena was pale. Charlotte's cup trembled slightly. Julian Fay looked down, his lips moving in silent repetition. James Ambrose did not blink. Poirot stepped back. We are left with many possibilities. A window opened without footprints, a missing draft of a letter, a voice behind a locked door, and now, anger. Deep, personal anger. He turned toward the door, preparing to leave. One more question, he said, almost offhand. Did any of you notice anything unusual at the time of the rain's silence? The group exchanged puzzled glances. Silence? Asked Charlotte. Poirot nodded. There was a single minute when the rain ceased, precisely at 7:14. Nature paused. And in that pause, I believe something unnatural occurred. He met Beatrice's eyes, and she nodded faintly. Do not forget it, mes amis, Poirot said softly, for in that minute lies the truth. And then, with a slight adjustment of his cuffs, he departed, leaving a room more unsettled than when he had entered. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. It was not uncommon for Hercule Poirot to make an impression, but at Rosemore Estate his presence was less like a thunderclap and more like the slow tightening of a velvet glove, discreet, elegant, yet undeniably in control. He had been at the manor less than 24 hours, and already the atmosphere had changed. The house, once somber and scattered in its grief, now held the hushed intensity of a courtroom just before verdict. Though the local constable, Inspector Laidlaw, had formally opened a preliminary inquest, it was Poirot to whom everyone turned, not merely because of his reputation, but because of his unshakable calm. Where others saw confusion, Poirot saw a pattern. Where others offered guesses, he waited for truths to reveal themselves through contradiction. That afternoon, he strolled along the west corridor of the manor, cane in hand, his step light but deliberate. He paused now and then to study a painting or adjust a crooked vase. Nothing escaped his notice, not the way the servants avoided certain doors, nor the glances exchanged between guests when they thought no one was looking. By 3 o'clock, he returned to the study. This time he was not alone. Inspector Laidlaw awaited him inside, mid-50s, lean, with hands that clenched when idle. He had little patience for what he called continental flourishes, but had the sense to defer when the situation outpaced him. Back again? Laidlaw asked, his voice edged with fatigue. I'd have thought you'd wrung everything from this room already. Poirot gave a small shrug. It is never the room that speaks, mon ami. It is the silence in between what people believe is important. Laidlaw frowned. Meaning? Poirot gestured to the desk. You see the missing inkwell? Laidlaw glanced. It was noted, likely misplaced. No, Poirot said quietly. It was removed deliberately. There is an outline of dust, clear as day. Someone took it after the murder. And what would they want with an inkwell? Poirot gave a thin smile. Perhaps nothing, unless it contained something other than ink. Laidlaw rubbed his jaw. Poison? Possibly. The glass that Lord Rosemore drank from, still wet on the inside, but dry where it was handled. That suggests the liquid was poured not long before his death. Laidlaw sighed. You believe someone poisoned him, then replaced or removed the decanter? None. The decanter is original, but it is likely that the poison, if poison it was introduced in a more subtle way. perhaps a drop added to his glass when no one was watching. "You mean during dinner?" Poirot nodded. "Or just after. You see, there is something else that intrigues me. The weather." Laidlaw raised a brow. "The rain?" "Yes," Poirot said, his tone quiet. "The rain, which fell steadily all evening, until it did not." 1 minute of silence. At 7:14 p.m. He stepped toward the fireplace, then to the window, which he opened wider. The air outside was cold, damp, but held the faintest scent of cigar smoke. La Pluie. She is a very reliable witness. One must ask, who would time a murder to coincide with such a moment? Laidlaw shook his head. Coincidence? No, monsieur. For a man like Lord Rosemore, so controlled, so exacting to die in a moment of unnatural silence, that is no coincidence. The two men stood in thoughtful quiet. Then Poirot spoke again. "I would like access to the servants' logs. Who entered this room yesterday? Who cleaned? Who lit the fire? Who delivered the drinks? Sometimes the smallest hands disturb the most dangerous things." By evening, Poirot had resumed his private interviews, choosing an antechamber beside the library as his base. The first to be summoned was Charlotte Ambrose. She arrived in a velvet shawl with a look of faint amusement. "Interrogation?" she asked, settling herself gracefully. "How very operatic." Poirot gave a courteous nod. "Madame, I prefer to think of it as conversation, with stakes." He offered tea, which she declined. "Madame Ambrose," he began, "you were a long-time friend of the family, yes? 20 years, give or take. Percival and Helena were frequent hosts. We've shared many an evening here. And your relationship with Lord Rosemore, was it always cordial?" She arched an eyebrow. "You mean, was I secretly in love with him, or did I hate him enough to poison his sherry?" Poirot smiled politely. "I mean only to understand your truth." She took a long breath. "Percival was a complex man, brilliant in his way, but arrogant, and in recent years, difficult. He no longer listened to advice. He made enemies where before he charmed. Enemies within the family." She hesitated, then looked away. Perhaps he had grown paranoid. He feared someone was manipulating him. "Did he name this person?" "No." "But you suspected?" "I did, and so did Elena." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, madame. That will be all, for now." As she left, Poirot turned back to his notes, writing a single line beneath her name. "Observes everything, says little." The second guest he summoned was Julian Fay. The young man entered quickly, face pale, collar misaligned. He carried his folio again, clutching it like armor. "Sit, monsieur," Poirot said kindly. Julian perched at the edge of the chair. "I didn't do anything, Monsieur Poirot. I only typed the letters. I never read them after he signed." "I believe you," Poirot said. "Tell me, on the day of Lord Rosemore's death, were you given any special instructions?" Julian nodded. "He asked me to prepare a sealed envelope. He dictated a short note. Told me to lock it in the black box in the study. I did. Is the note still there?" "No, I checked. The box was open." "Empty." Poirot sat back. "Then the note is missing." Julian's hands trembled slightly. "Someone must have taken it after he died." Poirot observed him in silence, then said, "One last question, monsieur. Did you ever hear Lord Rosemore speak of the rain?" Julian blinked. "The rain?" "Yes. Was it meaningful to him?" Julian paused. "He once said that if you listen carefully, the world tells you when something is about to happen. He said the rain was like a drum roll." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Merci. That is most poetic." As Julian departed, Poirot sat in quiet thought, his fingers tracing a small circle on the armrest of his chair. A drum roll, yes. And in that 1 minute of silence, the curtain had lifted. Now, It was time to study the stage. Chapter 5. Initial Interviews. Begin by the following morning. Poirot had requested that no one leave the estate. The household staff had been ordered to keep their routines as unchanged as possible, though Poirot had a way of ensuring they remained within his reach. Inspector Laidlaw, grudgingly respectful now, had agreed to delay any formal statement until Poirot had taken the measure of each player on the board, as he phrased it. In the solarium, Poirot had established his temporary interviewing quarters, a quiet room of dappled light, pale cushions, and tall palms that whispered faintly whenever the wind stirred. He chose it deliberately. It softened defenses. No one lies with the same conviction when surrounded by morning light and the scent of rosemary. Beatrice Lockwood was the first to be summoned. She arrived with her notebook tucked into the crook of her arm, her dark eyes wide but steady. Poirot gestured to the seat opposite. "Please, mademoiselle." "Let us speak comfortably." She sat, brushing a curl behind her ear. "You are close with Lady Helena, yes?" "She's my aunt," Beatrice said. "My mother's sister. I came here to stay after I finished at university. Literature, I believe. History. But I write, sometimes." Poirot gave a small smile. "Writers are excellent observers. You told me you heard raised voices near the study. That was not the only detail you noted, I imagine." Beatrice hesitated. "After the rain stopped? Just before the scream, I heard the grandfather clock strike once. Then footsteps, fast ones, not walking, running, on the upper landing." "Ah, and did you see who it was?" "No, but they were heavy. Not like a servant. Someone larger." "Merci, mademoiselle." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Did Lord Rosemore confide in you?" "Perhaps not directly, but in the way men sometimes unburden themselves when they think they're talking to someone without consequence." Her lips twitched faintly. "He said things. About the others." "Oui. And what did he say about Julian Fay?" Beatrice paused. "That he was bright but brittle. That people like Julian always seem loyal, until they believe they've been denied something they feel owed. And about Dr. Hartley. That he had secrets in his past. Lord Rosemore said that once, when they were both much younger, Hartley had risked everything for a patient who wasn't worth saving. That it taught him not to care anymore." Poirot nodded slowly. "And the Ambroses?" A longer pause. Then, "He never trusted them. Not really. He tolerated them because Helena insisted on it." Poirot folded his hands. "And Lady Helena?" Now Beatrice's voice softened. "He loved her, but he feared she was slipping away from him, not into madness, but into silence." Poirot studied her face for a long moment, then dismissed her gently. As the door clicked shut behind her, he made a single notation in his leather-bound diary. "She sees more than she understands, and more than she admits." The next to arrive was James Ambrose. Solid, blunt, and deliberate in every movement, he crossed the room as though pacing off territory. "Let's not waste time, Monsieur Poirot," he said, taking his seat without invitation. "You want to know where I was, what I did, and whether I wanted Percival dead. Would you care to answer those in reverse order?" Poirot asked mildly. Ambrose snorted. "I didn't kill him, but I didn't like him either. Arrogant man. Never forgave me for disagreeing with him about the estate's conservation plan." "Ah," Poirot said. "You believed he was damaging the land?" "He was draining the South Marshes for some development scheme. It would have ruined the ecosystem. I protested. We fought. End of story." Poirot tilted his head. "But the fighting wasn't the end, was it?" Ambrose's jaw tightened. "I never threatened him, but I won't lie. I stood to gain a little if he died. A minor clause in a deed. He left me stewardship of a small parcel, assuming he passed before 1950. I never asked for it." Poirot's gaze didn't flicker. Did you hear the rain stop, monsieur? Ambrose hesitated. Yes, it was strange. I was near the second-floor gallery. I remember pausing. Even the birds outside went quiet. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And did you see anyone on the upper floor? No, he said quickly. Too quickly. Then added, but I heard a door latch. Possibly the linen closet. Nothing more. Poirot made no comment, but as Ambrose left, he jotted down another line. Instinctively cautious. I know more. Hold it tight. Charlotte Ambrose followed next. Her perfume preceded her, rose and musk. She wore deep plum silken gloves, though it was no longer cold. She smiled as she entered, as if humoring a child's game. I confess, she said, I've always wanted to be part of one of your little puzzles, Monsieur Poirot, though I wish it hadn't come at such a price. Madame, Poirot said, I suspect you've already begun playing the game. Her smile twitched, then held. I ask only a few questions. Where were you at 7:14 p.m.? I had retired early to our rooms. My husband was still wandering the halls. He has that habit. Did you hear the clock? I did. Just one chime. It was strange, wasn't it? Almost theatrical. Poirot studied her gloves. And did you see Lord Rosemore in the hours leading up to his death? No, only at dinner. He seemed tense, as if he were building towards something. Poirot leaned forward. And were you? Her smile faltered. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, he said gently. You are a woman of performance, madame, but the curtain has not yet dropped. She rose without waiting for dismissal, and as the door closed, Poirot wrote, Theatrical instincts, not easily rattled, but I'm afraid of something. As he sat alone once more, Poirot glanced through his notebook, aligning timelines and behavior. The threads remained tangled, but now he had the beginning of a weave. One was brittle, one was quiet, one was hiding something, and one had heard the clock chime with guilt in their heart. The silence at 7:14 was no coincidence. It was a signal, and now the question was, who had timed their move to match it? Chapter 6. The first false lead. That afternoon, as wind rattled the tall hedgerows lining Rosemore Estate and the last of the storm's dampness clung to the window panes, a certain shift passed through the household, one of breathless anticipation, sharpened by Poirot's increasingly targeted inquiries. Whispers began to move among the guests like smoke. He suspects someone. He already knows. He's waiting for proof. And then, just past 4 o'clock, a cry rang out from the drawing-room. Julian Fay stood at the hearth, clutching a folded sheet of paper in one hand, his face pale with horror. His eyes were locked on the large fireplace grate, where burnt scraps of paper still clung to the edges of the ash pan. Poirot arrived swiftly, flanked by Inspector Laidlaw, and took the page from Julian without a word. Only a fragment of writing remained unmarred. Typed unmistakably in the same style as the unfinished letter Poirot had previously found. But this one was signed. Julian Fay. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And how did you come upon this, monsieur?" Julian stammered. I came to add kindling to the fire. I saw something wedged in the grate. I don't know how it survived the flames. Maybe it was caught between the logs." Laidlaw took a step closer. "And what exactly is this, Mr. Fay?" Julian's voice cracked. "It looks like a draft of a letter. From me. But I swear, I didn't write it." Poirot read the fragment aloud. "Cannot live with what I've done. The guilt burns through me. I never meant for it to go that far." Julian sank into a chair, visibly trembling. "I never wrote that," he whispered again. Poirot studied him for a long, quiet moment, then turned to Laidlaw. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur, perhaps now you would like to speak?" Laidlaw nodded, expression stern. "I'm afraid this places you in a compromising position, Mr. Fay. We'll need to search your quarters and take your typewriter into evidence." Julian's hands shot up as if to ward off invisible blows. My typewriter? But anyone could have used it. It's not locked. It's in the library. Laidlaw gestured to the constable at the door. Have it brought. We'll compare the key imprints. Poirot said nothing but watched the boy, yes, boy, despite his adult veneer, collapse into himself. It was not fear of guilt Poirot saw, but the dread of being misunderstood, caught in something greater than himself. Lady Helena entered moments later, drawn by the commotion. "What is this?" she asked, voice sharp. Julian rose shakily. "They think I killed him, Lady Helena. They found a letter in the fireplace, one I didn't write." She looked at Poirot. "Do you believe he did it?" Poirot gave the faintest shake of his head. "I believe, madam, that we are standing in the shadow of a deception, not its source." Still, the rumor spread before Julian could defend himself. The staff whispered behind kitchen doors. James Ambrose muttered that the boy had always seemed too quiet. Charlotte declared she'd never trusted him, despite his air of obedience. Even Beatrice, when asked privately by Poirot, admitted that Julian had been near the study more often than anyone else. "I thought he was just efficient," she said. "But maybe he was watching Lord Rosemore too closely." That evening, as Julian's room was searched, the constables found what appeared to be a bottle of sedatives hidden in his bedside drawer. An older pharmaceutical, labeled in a near-illegible scrawl, belladonna tincture, a toxic substance in excess often used historically for nerve pain and difficult to detect without specific testing. Laidlaw handed it to Poirot with the smugness of one closing a case. Poirot held the bottle in silence, studying the tiny cork stopper, the faded label. "La belladone," he murmured. "Deadly nightshade, subtle, elegant, and yet clumsy when hidden so plainly." Julian sobbed when shown the vial. "That's not mine. I didn't. Why would I leave it there if I meant to use it?" Laidlaw didn't respond. He'd already instructed the local magistrate to prepare a formal statement of suspicion. Later that night, Poirot stood in the upper gallery, overlooking the main entrance hall where shadows curled against the marble floor. Beatrice approached him quietly, hesitant but determined. "I don't believe he did it," she said. Poirot turned. "And why not?" "Mademoiselle, because he's terrified in the wrong way. Explain." "He's afraid of being caught, not of having done something wrong. There's a difference, and besides, Julian is a coward." Poirot considered this. A coward might still kill, if pressed. "But not with belladonna," she said. "He doesn't even drink tea without checking the label." Poirot smiled faintly. "You are observant, as always." "I'm not being loyal," Beatrice said. "Just honest." Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the burned letter fragment again. "This note is the key, but not because it was written, because it was planted." "You think someone forged it?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, and more than that, they timed its discovery. Just as with the minute of silence, they are staging a scene, one calculated to draw attention away from themselves." Beatrice frowned. "So who?" Poirot looked beyond her, toward the tall portrait of Lord Rosemore above the staircase. The man stared out as if still judging them all from beyond. "That," he said quietly, "is what I intend to find out. But not through their lies, through their contradictions." He stepped into the shadows. "In the theater of guilt," he said, "the first to weep may not be the first to fall, but they are always watched too closely." And with that, Poirot disappeared once more into the web of truth, where the threads of deception were just beginning to tremble. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The rain had given way to a brittle kind of stillness, leaden skies, unmoving leaves, and a chill that settled without ceremony. Within Rosemore's walls, the illusion of calm continued to fray. Julian Fay, though not arrested, remained sequestered in his quarters under the quiet eye of the constable posted at the end of the corridor. No charges had been filed, but suspicion lingered in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Poirot, for his part, moved with a fresh precision. He was narrowing his field, and the others could feel it. A certain tension gripped the drawing-room conversations, the passing glances at meals, the careful choice of words when answering harmless questions. On this particular afternoon, Poirot returned to the solarium, this time inviting Dr. William Hartley to join him. The physician appeared slightly disheveled. His tie knotted in haste, his spectacles smudged at the rim. He entered carrying a book under one arm, Medical Ethics, a historical review, and set it beside him like a talisman. Poirot gestured toward the chair. "Please, doctor. Sit." Hartley did, offering a terse nod. "I thought we might talk," Poirot began. "Not about facts, but about temperament." Hartley gave a guarded look. "Meaning?" "Lord Rosemore was a difficult man, yes?" Hartley exhaled. He could be unyielding, a perfectionist, distrustful of change, of contradiction, not a man easily liked, but not a man easy to hate either. "And you?" Poirot asked. "Did you like him?" "I respected him." "That is not the same." "No," Hartley admitted. "It isn't." Poirot observed the man's hands, thumb and forefinger rubbing absent-mindedly at the book's spine. "You have known him how long?" "Since university. We were not friends. We became closer later, when I returned to Windmere Hollow to set up my practice." He needed a discreet doctor. Why discreet? Percival dabbled in self-medication. He had insomnia, occasional arrhythmias. He didn't want anything in his file that might alarm his legal advisers. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Did you prescribe anything recently?" "Nothing unusual. He'd asked about sleeping draughts. I recommended a mild herbal tincture. Harmless." "And belladonna?" Hartley stiffened. "No, certainly not. It's practically obsolete." No physician would use it without good reason, and certainly not with someone like Lord Rosemore. He didn't respond well to sedatives. Poirot nodded, then paused. "Tell me, doctor, do you believe in psychological violence?" Hartley frowned. "Meaning?" "That a man may be murdered not with poison or a blow, but with the slow erosion of certainty." Hartley's mouth twisted slightly. "Emotional manipulation? Of course, it's not uncommon." "Then let us suppose," Poirot said, "that Lord Rosemore was being so manipulated by someone he trusted, that he had begun to doubt not only his surroundings, but his own mind. What might that do to a man so proud?" Hartley's jaw flexed. He'd become paranoid, isolated, prone to mistakes, possibly irrational. Poirot leaned in, lowering his voice. And might he begin to destroy evidence of what he feared? Burn letters, speak in riddles, record his thoughts cryptically? "Yes," Hartley said quietly. "He might." There was a pause. And then Poirot asked, almost casually, "Do you know where his journal is?" Hartley blinked. "No. Isn't it in the study?" Poirot shook his head. "It is missing, and I suspect it disappeared shortly after his death." Hartley said nothing. "Merci, doctor," Poirot said at last, standing. "That will be all." Later that day, Poirot requested a walk with Lady Helena. She agreed, though her demeanor had grown colder. They moved slowly through the east garden, past hedgerows still dripping from the storm. Her black gloves gleamed with dew as she touched the edge of a stone planter. "I imagine you suspect everyone by now," she said. "Even me?" "I suspect no one," Poirot replied gently. "I observe, and in observation, one often sees what others conceal without realizing." "Such as?" "Guilt. Not always of murder, but guilt nonetheless." She stopped walking. "What do you think I'm guilty of, Monsieur Poirot?" He turned to face her. Of allowing a storm to build inside your marriage that you no longer tried to stop. She looked away. Percival had changed. Oui, but so had you. Helena's voice was low. He was no longer the man I married. I loved his brilliance once. But toward the end, he saw enemies in every face. He accused Beatrice of stealing from him. He refused to sign Julian's recommendations. He threatened to disinherit James for opposing a drainage project. And you? He said I was keeping secrets, that I plotted with my friends behind closed doors. Did you? No, she said flatly. But I thought about it. Poirot didn't move. Sometimes, she said after a moment, I wish I had been cruel enough to do it. But I wasn't. I simply waited for the rain to stop. Poirot's eyes flickered. Pardon? She gave a hollow laugh. An old expression of mine. When things get unbearable, I tell myself, wait for the rain to stop. Everything feels clearer after. Poirot bowed his head slightly. A lovely phrase, perhaps not as metaphorical as it once was. They walked on. That evening, Poirot returned to the library. Alone now, he stood before the portrait of Lord Rosemore again. There was no warmth in the painting, only a man painted into permanence, more sculpture than flesh. Poirot spoke softly. You were afraid, not of death, but of being wrong. That is the worst sin for a man of intellect, no? He turned then to the fireplace, where the remnants of the burned note had been discovered. Kneeling beside the hearth, Poirot ran a gloved finger along the edge of the paneling, then paused. A subtle shift in the grain. He pressed. A click. A small wooden compartment popped open. Inside, a single sheet of paper. A journal page. Lord Rosemore's handwriting. The silence will be the signal. If I am right, it will come at 7:14. If not, then I am already mad. Poirot folded the page and stood. The rain may have stopped that night, but the storm had only just begun. And someone, somewhere, had counted on the silence to cover the sound of a soul breaking. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The discovery of the hidden journal page altered the rhythm of Poirot's investigation, not in its pace, but in its pulse. It suggested that Lord Rosemore had anticipated something, not merely death, but the precise moment of it. And that anticipation, calculated and recorded, meant that the crime had begun long before the poison touched the glass. By morning, Poirot's instructions were clear. No one was to enter the study, the solarium, or the library without permission. Inspector Laidlaw grumbled but complied. Poirot himself spent the better part of the early hours alone, writing methodically in a narrow leather journal, noting contradictions and consistencies in the timeline, in the words of the suspects, in the layers of silence that surrounded the case. And then, shortly after 11, Beatrice Lockwood came running. She burst into the solarium, breathless and pale. Monsieur Poirot, something's wrong. I can't find the will. Poirot rose at once. The will? In the cabinet, the fireproof drawer in the study. Aunt Helena told me to retrieve the old version, but it's missing. Poirot followed her down the corridor at once, Laidlaw close behind. In the study, the scene was unchanged. Papers stacked neatly, Lord Rosemore's chair still slightly askew. But the drawer in question, though unforced, was unmistakably empty. Locked? Laidlaw asked. No, Beatrice whispered. It was always left unlocked for internal drafts. The signed copy was meant to be in here. Poirot opened the drawer himself. Clean, wiped even. Not a single sheet of paper, nor a stray corner of one. He turned slowly. Who else knew it was here? Julian, Beatrice said. And Helena, and perhaps Dr. Hartley. He helped draft part of it. Laidlaw muttered. We'd already searched this room once. No sign of tampering then. Poirot's gaze darkened. That was before the distraction. Beatrice blinked. You mean Julian? Poirot gave a slow nod. The letter in the fireplace, the planted belladonna, the theatre of guilt, all orchestrated to draw attention elsewhere, whilst someone removed the one document that would have revealed motive beyond conjecture. Laidlaw crossed his arms. "You think someone came in during the night?" "No," Poirot said. "I think they came in during the noise." Not silence. He pointed to the ledger atop the desk. "Lord Rosemore's handwriting ends at 6:58 p.m. The murder occurred at 7:14, yes? But the drawer, this drawer, was not emptied in those minutes. It was emptied while everyone was gathered afterward, while Beatrice ran to fetch help, while the house was alive with panic." Poirot's eyes flicked to the hallway. The killer was not just bold. They were patient. Later that day, Poirot requested to see Julian again. The young man entered the solarium hesitantly, his features drawn, but his eyes clearer than before. "You've heard," Poirot said, "that the will is missing." Julian nodded. "Beatrice told me. I helped type the most recent version. I didn't see the final signatory page, but I knew who was being removed." Poirot tilted his head. "And who was that, Monsieur Fay?" Julian hesitated. "Charlotte Ambrose." Poirot blinked once. "Ah. She was one of the legacy beneficiaries," Julian said. "A trust Lord Rosemore established years ago, apparently out of gratitude. But he recently decided she'd taken advantage of it. She was due to receive a sizable estate in Cornwall." Did Lady Helena agree? "She didn't oppose it. In fact, I think she encouraged it." Poirot steepled his fingers. "You realize this places Madame Ambrose at the heart of two critical turns, the motive and the disappearance of the document." Julian nodded. "Yes. Did you tell anyone else about the change?" "No," Julian said. "Only Lord Rosemore and, well, perhaps Dr. Hartley overheard during dictation." Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then, gently, "Do you still have your typewriter, Monsieur Fay?" Julian blinked. "No. Inspector Laidlaw took it, for comparison." "Then you could not have typed the forged letter recently." "No, but someone could have typed it earlier. And held it." "Just so," Poirot murmured. "Merci." By late afternoon, Poirot requested an informal gathering in the drawing room. No accusations, no declarations. Just a conversation, though each suspect arrived as if summoned to confession. Charlotte Ambrose was the last to enter, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. Poirot stood before the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece. "My friends," he began, "the will is missing. It was taken not in the night, but during the noise, when emotion blinded logic. Someone used the fog of death to clear a path for their own survival." He let the words settle. "The forgery, the planted bottle, the vanished document, these are not acts of passion. They are calculated, and they speak to someone who knows more than they pretended to." Charlotte raised her hand delicately. "Are we to take that as an accusation, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "You may take it as a warning." Dr. Hartley folded his arms. "And what will you do now?" Poirot looked at each of them in turn. "Now, I will observe. One of you is losing control, and when you do, when the next mistake is made, I will be ready." That evening, as twilight bled into the manor's long corridors, a quiet figure slipped from the library into the study. The drawer was already empty, the fire long and cold. But they opened the desk anyway. Inside the middle drawer, beneath a false bottom, something waited. They reached in and froze. It was not what they expected, for Poirot had left something behind. Not evidence, but bait. And the trap had just begun to close. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The next morning dawned with an odd clarity, mistless, still, and sharp-edged, as though the world had chosen, for once, to reveal itself plainly. Yet within Rosemore Estate, the truth remained elusive, like a face glimpsed through rippling water. The house was quieter now, the chatter less frequent, the tension more concentrated. Even the servants moved with restrained caution, as if afraid of making the wrong sound in the wrong room. In the solarium, Poirot sipped his morning tisane and waited. He had baited the trap the night before with precision, a folded page in Lord Rosemore's hand, a decoy planted in the desk's false bottom, a note that appeared to outline a conspiracy between two names. It was not real, but someone had reached for it, and in doing so, they had revealed their fear. Poirot had waited in the hallway behind the velvet curtain, a faint creak, a flicker of movement, a silhouette half formed in the light. He did not confront them. Not yet. It was enough to know someone believed in the trap. And belief, as he knew well, often preceded collapse. Now he would begin to explore the why behind their fear. He summoned Dr. Hartley again just after breakfast, this time to the south study, warmer, brighter, less oppressive than the late Lord Rosemore's chamber of gloom. "You knew Charlotte Ambrose before she married, did you not?" Poirot asked, his tone mild. Hartley blinked. "Yes. We met during a medical fundraiser years ago." "And did you remain in contact?" "Occasionally. We both returned to Windmere Hollow around the same time. She moved to Rosemore's guest house when her husband began advising on the estate's legal holdings." Poirot nodded, jotting something in his notebook. "Tell me, Doctor, do you recall Lord Rosemore ever speaking of a previous scandal? Something he feared would resurface?" Hartley shifted. "He had fears about the past, mostly financial dealings. He once told me he'd made a mistake by offering an early inheritance advance to someone who then tried to blackmail him." "Do you know who?" "No, he never said." Poirot's voice dropped. "And yet you know, don't you, Doctor, that the Ambroses, James and Charlotte, were in considerable debt before they returned to the region?" Hartley did not answer, but his silence was louder than any affirmation. Next, Poirot requested a private word with Lady Helena. They walked again, this time in the winter garden, glass-panelled, overgrown with neglected vines. Light slanted through the dusty panes, catching on her dark dress. "You once told me, Madame," Poirot said softly, "that you and Charlotte were like sisters, and yet I find no trace of correspondence between you in recent years. No holiday cards, no letters from abroad, not until last year." "Why the gap?" Lady Helena's jaw tensed. "We had a falling out, years ago. We didn't speak for some time. And yet she returned." "Yes. Why?" "I invited her," she said, and then more quietly, "because Percival no longer trusted me, and I needed someone who remembered who I had been." Poirot nodded slowly, and when she returned, the atmosphere changed. "Yes," Lady Helena said. "She brought back the past, and with it, unresolved things." Poirot stopped walking. "Did Charlotte ever mention her financial state?" Helena hesitated. "Once. She said they'd lost something important, that they were starting over." Poirot said nothing. He simply turned toward the far door, where the glass was fractured near the hinge, just enough to let in a draught. Behind them, the vines rustled without wind. Poirot convened Beatrice shortly afterward. She entered with a furrowed brow, her notebook pressed to her chest. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, unprompted. "Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't think it mattered." "Go on," Poirot said, gesturing to her to sit. "The night before Lord Rosemore died, I saw Charlotte speaking with Julian, late in the garden corridor. She had her hand on his arm, and he looked distressed." "Did you hear anything?" "No. But afterward, Julian came inside looking pale. He avoided me." Poirot leaned forward. "You believe Charlotte was pressuring him?" "I don't know. But I think Julian was afraid of her. Poirot steepled his fingers. "And tell me, mademoiselle, have you ever seen Charlotte alone in the study?" Beatrice nodded. "Once. Months ago. I thought she was lost, but she claimed she'd come to return a book. She left in a hurry." Poirot stood. "Merci, Beatrice. You have done well." As she exited, Poirot returned to his notes, lines drawn, connections forming, Julian Fay manipulated, the Ambroses entangled in a vanished trust, Charlotte with access, motive and the performance of calm, a forged letter cast in Julian's voice, a will removed when confusion reigned, a step in the night triggered by bait, and still the minute of silence, the moment in which the truth had been timed to slip beneath notice. That night, Poirot sat by the fire in the drawing-room, the others gone to bed. In his lap, the forged letter. On the table, the burnt fragment from the fireplace. The strokes didn't match exactly. A different typewriter. A subtle but telling inconsistency. He tapped the ashtray gently. "The forger," he murmured, "was confident. Too confident. And so they chose a machine never meant to be noticed." He glanced toward the piano in the corner, and beneath it, the gleam of brass. The leg of a writing desk no one had yet touched. He stood, approached, and pulled it open. Inside, an antique Remington typewriter, and in the ribbon, just faintly, an impression of the phrase, "The guilt burns through me." Poirot smiled. It was not Julian's. No, this was someone else's confession, written in someone else's hand. And now, the time of patience is ending. The trap had been sprung, and the spider was already tangled in her own web. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The morning after his quiet discovery, Poirot descended to breakfast a touch later than usual, though his manner remained crisp as ever. He joined the others in the east dining room, Lady Helena already seated in her widow's black, stirring her tea with mechanical precision, Dr. Hartley folding a newspaper with forced calm, James and Charlotte Ambrose seated side by side, but each angled ever so slightly away from the other, and Beatrice Lockwood at the far end, a volume of verse untouched on her plate. Julian was absent. Laidlaw, who had also joined the table out of habit more than appetite, muttered, "Boy's still in his room, sick with worry, maybe guilt." Poirot didn't answer. Instead, he observed, always observing. Who met whose eye, and who did not, whose hand trembled on the fork, whose voice broke the silence first. "Forgive me," Charlotte Ambrose said suddenly, with just enough theatrical inflection, "but I must ask, how much longer must we remain here, Monsieur Poirot? Surely the authorities have enough to form an arrest, or at the very least, a declaration of innocence." Poirot folded his napkin gently. "You are quite right, madame. We are nearing the final act." James Ambrose raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." Poirot stood, adjusting his cuffs. "The facts are beginning to form a pattern, one that no longer shifts under our feet. But to confirm it, I must move quietly, without interruption." He turned to Laidlaw. "Might I trouble you for a brief meeting in the study?" Laidlaw rose, confused but obliging. "Of course." As the two men left the dining room, Poirot gave Beatrice a faint nod. Her eyes widened slightly, and she closed her book. Something had passed silently between them. In the study, Poirot shut the door and drew the drapes. He did not speak for a long moment, pacing the room in slow, deliberate strides. Then, with great care, he reached into his coat and produced the folded page he had discovered beneath the piano the night before. "This," he said softly, "is the piece they never expected me to find." Laidlaw took the page and read it. The typing was faint, but legible, and beneath the ink, the distinctive punch of a Remington typewriter, one not previously catalogued. "But this isn't Julian's," Laidlaw said. "This machine's older." "Precisely," said Poirot, the one found beneath the piano. It was used for occasional guest correspondence. Decorative, but functional. No one thought to check it, until now. Laidlaw frowned. So the forged letter, Julian's so-called confession, wasn't his at all? No, Poirot said. And here is the brilliance. It was composed before the murder. Planted to be found after. A story designed before the final scene began. A pre-written confession to accompany a posthumous discovery. Laidlaw sat down heavily. So you're saying whoever wrote this planned not only the murder, but the framing in advance? Oui. And they knew exactly how to pull the strings. They understood psychology. They knew Julian's nervous disposition, his isolation, his eagerness to please. They knew no one would question it, so long as the confession arrived amid panic. But who? Laidlaw asked, already knowing the answer before the name left Poirot's lips. Charlotte Ambrose. Laidlaw closed his eyes. You're sure? Poirot gestured to the forged page. She used a typewriter that only a resident guest would know about. She had the motive, the revoked inheritance, the financial desperation. She had the access, and she had the nerve. Laidlaw exhaled slowly. You have proof? Poirot tapped his temple. Not yet. But soon. By early afternoon, Poirot asked Beatrice to assist him with a private task. Together, they entered the manor's attic, a long, dust-choked space with beams like cathedral arches and forgotten trunks lining the walls. He explained little, only that he was seeking an echo left behind. Beatrice obeyed without question, shining the torchlight across stacks of antique boxes and furniture draped in yellowing sheets. What are we looking for? She finally asked. Poirot paused before a cedar trunk. Lord Rosemore's personal effects, things he stored when he wanted to forget them but not destroy them. He opened the trunk. Inside, old ledgers, photographs, and at the bottom, a cracked leather folio. Inside were letters, many unsigned, many emotional in tone. They spoke of debts repaid, of guilt unshared, of a friendship that had become a burden. Beatrice read aloud from one. She never truly forgave me for choosing Helena. But I never expected her to repay love with calculation. Beatrice looked up. Who wrote these? Poirot removed a final envelope, torn but intact. It bore a name, Charlotte Ambrose, and a single date, March 1919. Well, Poirot said softly, we are now ready. That night, Poirot sat once more before the fire. The forged letter rested beside the genuine one. One, a lie rehearsed in careful type. The other, the truth written with a wounded hand. Both now in Poirot's possession. And still, he said nothing. Because the trap was not yet closed, but soon the music was nearly over, and someone in her final note would strike the wrong chord. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The following day unfolded like the breath before a storm, taut, brittle, and heavy with the unspoken. Conversations around Rosemore grew fewer, the clinking of porcelain at breakfast louder than words. Something had shifted. They could all feel it, though none could say what precisely had changed. Hercule Poirot, ever the still point in the turning wheel, made no proclamations. Instead, he moved gently through the house, speaking little, watching much. He was no longer gathering facts. He was studying nerves, and they were beginning to fray. It was just past noon when Beatrice Lockwood slipped quietly into the drawing room. She found Charlotte Ambrose already there, seated beside the window with a book untouched in her lap. The light behind her made her features sharper, more angular, like a portrait not yet finished. "You haven't been sleeping," Beatrice said. Charlotte looked up, surprised but composed. "Neither have you, dear." Beatrice took a seat across from her. "Do you believe Julian will be charged?" Charlotte tilted her head. That depends on what Monsieur Poirot decides to share with the inspector, doesn't it? There was something too careful in her tone. You don't think he's guilty, do you? Beatrice asked, studying her. Charlotte smiled faintly. Guilt is never as simple as the law wishes it to be. A long silence. Then, did you know Lord Rosemore was planning to change his will? Beatrice asked quietly. Charlotte's hands stilled on her lap. Everyone heard whispers. He was impulsive toward the end, unstable. But you were to lose everything. Charlotte's smile did not falter, but it no longer reached her eyes. What a curious thing to say. Beatrice stood. Curious things happen when people lose what they believe belongs to them. She left before Charlotte could reply. By mid-afternoon, Julian Fay emerged from his room for the first time in nearly 2 days. He stood uncertainly at the threshold of the library, where James Ambrose sat polishing a pair of brass candlesticks with an uncharacteristic attention to detail. Julian cleared his throat. I just wanted to say, thank you for not joining the chorus against me. James didn't look up. Don't thank me yet. I simply keep my thoughts to myself until they're fully formed. Julian hesitated. Do you believe I did it? James paused. I believe people can be made to look guilty, and I believe someone in this house is very, very good at that. Julian glanced at the desk in the corner. Someone used a different typewriter, didn't they? Not mine. James nodded. Poirot told you? No. But I saw him examining Remington, the one under the piano. James finally met his eyes. Then perhaps you're not so much a suspect as you are bait. Julian turned pale. He's setting a trap. James stood slowly, setting the candlestick aside. He already did. Now he's watching who walks into it. He moved past Julian and out into the corridor. That evening, as the storm returned, not of rain this time, but wind, rattling the old windows and echoing in the stairwells, the guests were called once more to the drawing-room. Poirot stood near the fire, calm and composed. A folded letter in one hand, a worn envelope in the other. There is something I must share with you, he said softly, though not all at once. The group settled, the air tight with apprehension. This envelope, he said, holding it up, was discovered in the attic. It is addressed not to Lord Rosemore, but from him, and it speaks not of legal matters, but of love. Love betrayed. Charlotte shifted. That sounds rather dramatic, Monsieur Poirot. Oui, madame. It is. He turned toward Lady Helena. Do you know what this house has become? Not a sanctuary, but a stage. Everyone is performing now, including you. Helena looked away, her hands trembling slightly. Poirot stepped toward Dr. Hartley. And you, mon ami, you have held back information not out of malice, but out of shame. You knew Charlotte Ambrose before she became respectable, before she married. Hartley's jaw clenched. You warned Lord Rosemore about her, didn't you? I did, Hartley said hoarsely. Years ago, he wouldn't listen. Because he believed in forgiveness, Poirot said, and he believed that someone, even a former confidant, would never harm him. Poirot turned to James Ambrose. And you, monsieur, have tried to stay silent, but silence is not neutral. It protects someone, your wife. James said nothing. Poirot nodded slowly. So now, the question becomes, who will break first? Later that night, alone in his room, Poirot wrote a single sentence in his small notebook. She's watching everyone now, especially him. He underlined the final word, him. Not Poirot, not Laidlaw, Julian. Because the person who planted the forged confession expected him to collapse eventually. But Poirot had seen the strength in the boy's fragility, and he had seen something else too. Fear, not of being caught, but of being outplayed. Tomorrow he would let them turn on each other. He would simply stand still, and let the lies reveal who trembled first. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The next day began not with a scream nor a revelation, but a silence that felt curated, like the deliberate hush before a string snaps. Even the air in Rosemore Manor seemed to pause. The storm had passed, but its imprint remained: damp corridors, cold hearths, and glances exchanged like whispered threats. Poirot had not summoned anyone that morning. He had not been seen in the dining room, nor in the study. This absence, subtle but pointed, created a vacuum the others rushed to fill. It was Julian who spoke first. In the drawing room, as Lady Helena quietly rearranged a vase of white lilies and Beatrice scribbled in her notebook near the window, Julian entered with a visible weight on his shoulders. "I think we should talk," he said, his voice higher than usual, but firm. Lady Helena looked up, startled. "About what?" "About who's really responsible for what's happened," Julian said, glancing briefly at Beatrice, then away. "I'm tired of being the name everyone mutters when the room empties." From the hall, James Ambrose entered silently, Charlotte behind him, eyes narrowed. "Bold words," she said, taking a seat. "And what exactly do you have to share, Julian?" He turned toward her. "You frightened me. That night, before Lord Rosemore died. You said things I didn't understand, but I understand them now." Charlotte gave a brittle laugh. "You're imagining things, boy." "No? You said he was going to ruin everything for you, that he'd already decided to cut you out of the will." James tensed. Lady Helena's fingers tightened on the vase. Julian pressed on. "You told me I could fix it, that I had access, that if something happened to the will it wouldn't matter. And then the next day you told me to say nothing about our conversation." Charlotte crossed her arms. "You're misremembering. You were upset. You misunderstood." "No," Julian said louder. "You used me." A door clicked open behind them. Poirot entered, quietly, without ceremony. "Bon," he said, stepping into the room. "We have arrived at the point of confession. How very theatrical." Charlotte stood. "He's lying. He's making this up to save himself." Poirot did not look at her. "What are lies, Madame Ambrose, but truths told by the wrong person?" He turned to Julian. "Did you do as she asked?" Julian's throat bobbed. "No, I was scared. I left everything in place. I thought maybe she was bluffing." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then I must thank you, for you preserved the very clue she hoped to destroy." He drew from his pocket the envelope discovered in the attic, the one with Charlotte's name and Lord Rosemore's bitter handwriting. "March 1919, Poirot said. "A date forgotten by most, but not by him. This letter, never sent, speaks of betrayal, of a friend who returned not out of loyalty, but for something owed. Someone who once demanded a sum in exchange for silence." He looked directly at Charlotte. "Is that not so?" Her jaw remained set, but her fingers tightened around her shawl. "You arrived back at Rosemore not out of affection, but necessity. You learned of the coming change in the will, perhaps from Dr. Hartley, perhaps by other means. And so you crafted a plan. You needed a scapegoat, a way to turn suspicion." She didn't speak. "You composed the forged letter on the Remington," Poirot continued. "Planted the belladonna in Julian's drawer. Removed the will while the house was in chaos. And then, when all eyes were elsewhere, you waited, certain that guilt would sink its teeth into the wrong neck." Charlotte's voice, when it came, was thin but sharp. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," Poirot said gently. He turned to Beatrice. "Mademoiselle Lockwood, would you be so kind?" Beatrice stepped forward and placed on the table a sheet of carbon paper, faintly marked with the last impressions of a sentence typed not on Julian's underwood, but the Remington from under the piano. It matched the forged letter perfectly. Charlotte stared at it, then turned slowly to James. He met her eyes, but said nothing. "No one was supposed to find it," she said at last. "Not that damned piano desk. Not that old machine." Poirot folded his hands. "The mind is a clever thing, madame. But the body, the hands, often forgets its own habits." Laidlaw entered the room then, as if summoned by fate, and stood beside Poirot. Charlotte straightened her shoulders. "I didn't poison him," she said flatly. "No," Poirot agreed, "but you created the stage. You lit the fuse, and you ensured that when the curtain rose, someone else would be standing in the spotlight." Charlotte looked at her husband. "Are you going to say anything?" James, silent for so long, exhaled. "What's left to say?" Charlotte closed her eyes. The silence at 7:14 had been hers, a minute carved out of noise to allow guilt to move unseen. And now, in another silence, her web collapsed around her. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The confession, or what passed for it, hung in the air like dust unsettled by a sudden breeze. Charlotte Ambrose's words had not been a full admission, but they were enough. Enough to change the shape of suspicion, enough to make her husband turn away without a word, enough to force silence across the room that no one dared to break. Poirot, with his hands clasped gently before him, gave no triumphant speech. He merely nodded, as though he had known all along that the final card in the deck would reveal its face with a whisper, not a shout. Inspector Laidlaw moved to speak, but Poirot stopped him with a slight lift of his hand. "No, not yet, mon ami," he murmured. "Let the performance finish of its own accord." Charlotte stood motionless for a time, her eyes darting between the faces around her. Julian looked at her with a kind of stunned betrayal, while Beatrice, tight-lipped, stiff-backed, watched as if bracing for something unseen. Helena looked only at the floor. Hartley had retreated to the far side of the fireplace, hands shoved into his pockets, mouth drawn. Then Charlotte spoke again. "You still don't understand," she said, her voice brittle but controlled. "I didn't do it. I didn't kill him." "Perhaps not," Poirot replied, "but you created the illusion around which the crime could be executed. You planted the lie. The murder itself was almost incidental." Charlotte gave a hollow laugh. "I suppose that's meant to absolve me." "No, madame," Poirot said, "only to clarify the charge." By evening the drawing-room had emptied. The others dispersed in knots of quiet discussion and visible unease. Julian returned to his quarters. Lady Helena had retired early, pale and withdrawn. Even James Ambrose had disappeared into the old billiards-room alone. Poirot remained in the study. Laidlaw sat across from him, weary but alert. "We'll hold her until we can formalize things. What you laid out, it's not everything, but it's enough to detain her for obstruction and attempted perversion of justice." Poirot nodded slowly. "Oui, but there is more. The death itself, it remains open. You don't think she poisoned him?" "No," Poirot said. "Her talent is misdirection. She built the story, but the act, that was not her hand." Laidlaw frowned. "Then who?" Poirot's gaze shifted toward the window. "That is the question that must now be answered, and it must be answered quickly, for I fear the murderer is aware that Charlotte's mask has cracked and will not wait for the rest to fall." That night, just after 1 o'clock, footsteps echoed faintly across the south wing. Poirot, who had not yet gone to bed, was seated in the upper library, rereading Lord Rosemore's old journals with quiet intensity. The sound, soft but rushed, drew his attention. He rose and followed. Through the corridor, down the central stair, past the darkened drawing-room, toward the rear of the house, where the study sat locked and quiet. A figure moved through the shadows. Charlotte Ambrose, dressed in a heavy coat, her hair pinned back hastily, a valise tucked beneath one arm. She didn't hear him until the latch of the side door clicked. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "this is not the way." Charlotte froze. Her hand was on the bolt. A single candle flickered from the wall sconce nearby, casting her profile in thin, sharp light. "You have no right to stop me," she said. "I'm not stopping you. I'm offering you the opportunity not to destroy what little remains." Charlotte's eyes gleamed. "What remains? My reputation? My freedom? You've already taken both." Poirot took a step forward. "No, madame. I've only asked for the truth. It is you who chose to disguise it." She turned toward him slowly. "You think you've won?" "No," Poirot said. "Only that we are closer. But, madame, I beg of you, running now. It will seal your fate. You are not guilty of murder. You can still speak to motive without the stain of violence. Do not become something you are not." Charlotte's hand wavered on the bolt. A silence passed between them. Then she exhaled. "I only wanted it not to be me," she said. "For once in my life, not me." She let the bag fall to the floor. Poirot stepped forward, took her by the elbow, and guided her gently back through the door. At dawn, Poirot stood once more in the drawing-room, gazing at the portrait of Lord Rosemore above the fireplace. Dr. Hartley entered quietly behind him. "Is it done, then?" Hartley asked. Poirot shook his head. "Not yet. The frame is complete. But the canvas, it is still missing the final brushstroke." Hartley poured himself a drink from the sideboard. "She's not the only one who wanted him dead." "No," Poirot said. "But she is the one who made it possible." He turned to Hartley. "Now comes the hardest question, mon ami. Not who had the chance, but who had the courage to finish what she began." And with that, Poirot stepped into the hall, the sound of his footsteps soft and final. The last move had not been made, but the board was nearly cleared. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The house no longer creaked from the weather. The storm had passed in every sense but one. The private one, the kind that lingers after lightning has scorched through something it cannot give back. Within Rosemore Estate, there was no visible damage, no broken glass or shattered beams. And yet, something was fractured beyond repair. Charlotte Ambrose remained in the smallest guest room, now guarded by a constable. She had not spoken since her failed flight. Her silence was not defiant. It was something quieter, more inward, the sound of resignation. But the question that lingered in Poirot's mind, more stubbornly than any other, was not about her guilt. It was about who had followed her through the door she'd opened. Poirot spent the morning in the study, seated not behind the desk, but beside the fireplace. The portrait of Lord Rosemore loomed above. The man's painted eyes had seen the entire descent, his death, his secrets, and now his final undoing. A knock sounded at the door. "Entrez," Poirot said. Beatrice Lockwood stepped in. She looked worn but determined, carrying her notebook beneath one arm. She didn't sit until he gestured. "I've been thinking," she said. "Bon. I have been doing the same. I can't stop wondering about the minute of silence," she continued. "That strange gap when the rain stopped. It was real, I know it. It framed the murder, didn't it?" "Oui, mademoiselle. It framed it precisely." She opened her notebook and handed him a page. "I've written out the timeline from that evening. The moments I was near the stair, the way the grandfather clock struck once at 7:14, the footsteps I heard above, and something else." Poirot read the page in silence. Beatrice leaned forward. "It doesn't match what Dr. Hartley said. He claimed to be with James Ambrose until just before dinner. But if he was on the upper floor at 7:14, who was he visiting?" Poirot looked up. "Ah," he said softly. "Now you begin to see." She nodded. "Julian. It must have been. That's whose voice I heard arguing with Lord Rosemore." Poirot stood and walked to the window. "No," he said. It was not Julian's voice you heard. Julian is many things, nervous, naive, impressionable, but not reckless. Beatrice frowned. Then who? Poirot turned slowly, hands folded behind his back. Who is a man who knows dosage, who knows the body's limits and how to breach them without trace, who has the access, the trust, the authority to place a substance in a drink and call it medical advice? Beatrice whispered it. Dr. Hartley. Poirot nodded. It was nearly midday when Poirot found Hartley in the winter garden, seated beneath a tangle of dormant vines and brittle trellises. The man held a cigarette between two fingers, unlit. He looked like he hadn't slept. "I knew you'd come," he said without turning. Poirot sat beside him. "You were clever, my friend, but not invisible." Hartley chuckled bitterly. "You always wait until the rest have fallen away, don't you? Until the lie thins." "It is not always the lie I watch," Poirot replied. "Sometimes it is the timing." Hartley exhaled slowly. "She set the stage. I only had to step through it." "Why?" "She pushed him too far," Hartley said, voice low. "And he pushed back, accused me of incompetence. Threatened to expose something from years ago, a malpractice case I'd buried. If he spoke, it would resurface. My license, my life, ruined. You feared exposure more than justice. I feared being irrelevant." He looked at Poirot. "He trusted me with his health. That made it easy." Poirot nodded once. "You chose belladonna." "A small tincture," Hartley confirmed. "Enough to mimic natural failure. No trace if you don't look for it." "You gave it to him at dinner?" "In his glass. While he was distracted. I knew he'd take it to the study afterward, as he always did." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. And the minute of silence. Hartley gave a small, grim smile. "Chance. But I used it. I heard the clock strike, knew what time it was. I checked the corridor. And then I waited for the scream. You knew Charlotte would cover for you. She never knew what I did. She thought the lie would protect her from the will's exposure. But all she did was protect me." Poirot said nothing. After a long silence, Hartley stood. "Well," he said, "I suppose this is the part where you fetch the constable." Poirot didn't move. "No, doctor, I will not fetch him." Hartley blinked. "You're letting me go?" "No," Poirot said. "I am letting you walk to him. It is better that way." Hartley nodded once, slowly, and without another word, he walked back into the house. Later that evening, Poirot stood once more in the drawing room. Only Beatrice remained. "So it was both of them," she said quietly. "Charlotte and Dr. Hartley." "Yes, but only one struck the final blow." Beatrice looked toward the window. The rain had not returned. "He waited for the silence," she said. Poirot nodded, and in that moment he told himself he was sparing the world a cruel man. But in truth, he was only saving himself. They said nothing more. The silence had returned. But this time, it was not unnatural. It was simply the end. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The drawing room had changed, not in appearance, but in energy. The tension that once curled in its corners like mist had lifted, leaving in its place something cooler, something heavier. Finality. Poirot stood before the hearth, immaculate as ever, his posture still and composed, as if he had not spent the last 3 days peeling back layers of grief, deceit, and carefully concealed guilt. The fire crackled behind him, a low rhythm to what was to come. One by one. The household entered at his request. Lady Helena was the first. Stoic, her mourning veil absent now, replaced with a shawl of understated elegance. Her eyes betrayed little, but something in her bearing had shifted. A quiet acceptance. Julian Fay followed, hesitant but no longer shrinking. He took a seat near the French doors and folded his hands tightly in his lap. Beatrice Lockwood came next, her notebook left behind for once. She said nothing, but her presence was alert, watchful, as if she knew the moment ahead would live in her memory, forever. James Ambrose entered last, alone. There was no sign of Charlotte. Poirot did not ask after her. There was no need. At last, Inspector Laidlaw arrived, coat damp from the light drizzle outside, hat in hand. He gave a nod to Poirot and took a seat, notebook at the ready. Poirot waited until the room had fallen into a natural silence. Then he began. Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you for your patience. You have each borne the burden of suspicion, and now it is time to unburden you, or, for some, to confront the truth. He paced slowly in front of the hearth. Lord Rosemore was not a man without enemies. He controlled tightly, he withheld generously, and in his final weeks he began to unmake the very arrangements that held this household together. Some of you feared losing wealth, others feared exposure, all of you, in some way, feared change. His eyes passed over them gently. But fear is not guilt. Fear alone does not kill. He turned to Laidlaw. The original assumption was that Lord Rosemore died of sudden cardiac arrest, perhaps brought on by stress, perhaps by some hereditary condition, but that assumption failed to account for two things. He raised one finger. First, the presence of belladonna, a tincture subtle enough to pass unnoticed. It does not leave dramatic signs, but it silences the heart all the same. A second finger. Second, the timing. The moment of death coincided with a 1-minute silence in the rain. This was no mere poetic coincidence. It was chosen, anticipated, and within that minute the deed was done. Lady Helena spoke softly. You believe someone timed it to that moment? Poirot nodded. Yes, not to avoid being seen, but to control the narrative. In the quiet, everything sounds louder. A fall, a gasp, a scream. He looked to Julian. You were never meant to be the killer, mon garçon. You were meant to be the distraction, the forged confession, the bottle planted in your drawer, the whispers that you were growing desperate. All of it constructed by one mind, Charlotte Ambrose. James Ambrose shifted in his chair but said nothing. Poirot continued. Madame Ambrose feared being written out of the will. She feared irrelevance, and she believed she could shape perception. She did not poison Lord Rosemore, no, but she cleared the path. Julian whispered. She manipulated everything. Poirot gave a small nod. Indeed, but it was not her hand that ended his life. He turned slowly. The final act belonged to Dr. William Hartley. Gasps rose from several in the room. Poirot's voice remained even. He feared disgrace, exposure, a scandal from his past that Lord Rosemore, in his increasing bitterness, threatened to revive. Hartley had motive, access, and knowledge. He administered a fatal dose, wrapped in the disguise of a sleeping draught. And when the minute of silence came, he did not need to act further. He simply waited for death to arrive. Laidlaw exhaled. He's confessed, then? Yes, Poirot said. He will surrender himself. His silence is over. A hush followed. Lady Helena leaned forward. And what of the will? Poirot produced an envelope from his inner pocket, recovered from a locked folio in the attic, hidden not by Charlotte, but by Lord Rosemore himself. He feared his own mind. He changed it often. He hid things from others, and from himself. He handed the envelope to Laidlaw. It confirms that Charlotte had indeed been written out, but it also reveals something else. A small legacy left to one who had never asked for anything. He looked at Beatrice. Miss Lockwood, your uncle left you the summer house and the wooded land around it, for your quiet observations and unspoken loyalty. Beatrice's eyes widened. I didn't know. Poirot smiled. That is why you received it. He turned to the others. The story is complete, but not all stories end in punishment. Some end in reflection. He bowed slightly. I leave that to the law and to your own conscience. Poirot walked to the door, paused, and added softly, in the end, it was not the poison, nor the storm, nor the silence that killed him. It was fear. Fear, when unspoken, becomes the most lethal thing in any house. And with that, he stepped into the corridor, leaving the rest to reckon with what remained. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The day after the final gathering dawned pale and muted, as though the very light had been chastened by the revelations that echoed through Rosemore's long halls. Word of Dr. Hartley's quiet surrender had already begun to circulate through the nearby village, though few knew the details. Those who remained within the estate carried themselves as though walking through the final act of a play whose lines had been delivered, but whose silence remained unresolved. In the drawing-room, Poirot stood alone. No audience now. No suspects, no constables, no speeches required. He stood by the tall window, gazing out at the mist-shrouded rose garden, his reflection faint in the glass. A solitary figure still sorting through the residue of truth. Behind him, a soft knock. Beatrice Lockwood entered, her expression unreadable. In her hands, she held a folded piece of parchment. Poirot turned with a nod. "Mademoiselle," she approached, "you left this in the study." He accepted the paper. It was not something he had misplaced. It was the final page of Lord Rosemore's journal, the one recovered from the false bottom weeks earlier. He unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words remained sharp. "When the rain stops, I will know the truth. I have said too much to those who don't listen and too little to the ones who see. But I no longer fear silence. I fear who hears it." Poirot read it again in silence. Then he folded it and tucked it into his breast pocket. Beatrice hesitated. "Do you think he knew?" Poirot looked at her gently. "Knew that death was near?" "Yes." "Knew who would deliver it?" "No, but he knew someone would. That is why he prepared the silence. It was not a prophecy. It was an invitation." "To who?" "To guilt. He left it to knock." Beatrice sat down on the window bench. "Will you stay until Charlotte is taken?" Poirot shook his head. "No, that is Inspector Laidlaw's duty now. The part of the performance that requires the law has concluded." "What happened to James?" she asked. "He did nothing, but he knew." Poirot gave a sad smile. To live beside a lie long enough is its own kind of sentence. He will not speak of this again. Nor will anyone make him. They sat together for a moment. The hush between them filled only by the soft tapping of rain on glass. The storm had returned. Not fierce, but steady. A cleansing rain. One that did not silence, but soothed. Beatrice finally asked, "Why did you come here, Monsieur Poirot?" "Truly?" He turned toward her. "Because Lady Helena wrote to me, not about a crime, but about a feeling. That something in her house no longer made sense. That the quiet between conversations had changed. That she was not afraid of death, but of confusion." Beatrice nodded slowly. "So she felt it before it happened." "Yes, as many do, but they cannot name it. That is where I come in." Poirot stood. "Now it is time for me to go." Beatrice rose, but he held up a hand. "Before I leave," he said, "you must promise me something." "Of course. You will write it down, all of it, but not for the newspapers, not for justice, for memory, because this, what happened here, it is not just a puzzle, it is a lesson. And you, mademoiselle, are the only one who has been watching closely enough to tell it truly." She blinked, then slowly, she nodded. "I will." Poirot gave a satisfied nod and made for the door. Just before stepping out into the corridor, he turned back and said with a small, knowing smile, "Ah, And do not forget to title it properly." She tilted her head. "What would you suggest?" He thought for a moment. "The Rain That Stopped for 1 minute." And with that, he disappeared from view. Beatrice stood in silence for a long while. Then she sat once more, opened her notebook to a clean page, and began to write. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Charlotte Ambrose was escorted from Rosemore Estate at precisely 8:15 the following morning. The constable's carriage arrived with little fanfare, the wheels crunching over wet gravel, the horses steaming in the soft drizzle. She descended the front steps in silence, dressed in a neat navy traveling coat, hair pinned in perfect symmetry. There were no tears, no shouts of injustice, only the sort of cold composure found in those who've learned to turn punishment into performance. James Ambrose stood by the door but did not speak to her. Their eyes met only once, and in that gaze was something unspoken, not hatred, not love. Something older, perhaps recognition. Poirot did not attend her departure. His luggage had been collected before sunrise. He had already gone. Inside the house, the others watched from different windows. Beatrice stood alone in the gallery above the entry hall. Lady Helena remained seated in the music room, eyes closed as the piano's last note hung in memory. Julian, silent and hollow-eyed, lingered by the study door, as if waiting to be summoned again by someone who would never call. And thus ended Charlotte's carefully managed fall, from house guest to legacy seeker to orchestrator of suspicion, but not murderer. By the week's end, news of Dr. Hartley's confession had reached the region in hushed, incredulous tones. That he, the mild, competent, unobtrusive physician, had been capable of murder struck many as more disturbing than the act itself. The court proceedings were set to begin within the fortnight. Laidlaw, with the help of a signed affidavit and Poirot's detailed testimony, had everything necessary. Dr. Hartley offered no plea, no defense, only a short, tired statement when asked why. "I thought I could quiet it before it ruined me. I didn't realize how loud it would be after." Lady Helena chose not to attend the hearing. Her grief had shifted forms. It was no longer mourning for a husband, but mourning for what had grown around him. The rot that had festered behind walls of politeness, inside afternoon teas and garden parties, had finally cracked through. And yet, despite the sorrow, she felt lighter. A kind of clarity had emerged, like sunlight over broken stone. One evening she found Beatrice in the winter garden. "I've read your draft," she said. Beatrice looked up from her writing desk, startled. "I wasn't sure I should show you yet." "You were right to," Helena replied. "And it's good, true." Beatrice hesitated. "Do you think he would have hated it?" "Your uncle?" "No." Helena smiled faintly. "He might have corrected your grammar, but he would have respected honesty." Beatrice closed the notebook. "Will you stay here?" "For a while. The house needs a season of silence." She turned to leave, then added, "But someday, perhaps it should open again, when the ghosts are less eager to speak." Julian Fay left 2 days later. A quiet departure, unnoticed by most. He had taken a post in London, secured for him by Lady Helena through an old legal acquaintance. Beatrice found him standing by the old rose trellis before the carriage arrived. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For not knowing how to say no. For letting someone else's fear become my burden." She nodded. "You're not the only one who lets silence speak louder than truth." He offered her a small envelope before stepping away. Inside was a note, typed, not handwritten. "Don't let the world harden you. Some of us are still soft because we survived." Beatrice read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it between the pages of her manuscript. On Poirot's final day at Rosemore, hours before he vanished into the fog-bound countryside, he left behind a single envelope for Beatrice. No return address, no formal letter, just a small card bearing 7 words, underlined once. Truth is not found, it is arranged. And below it, in elegant ink, H.P. By the end of the month, the rain returned, not heavy, but steady, a constant rhythm. The estate remained still, save for Beatrice, now the quiet keeper of the summer house and its untamed grounds. She wrote in the mornings, walked in the afternoons, and every so often stood beneath the bare branches and listened. There was always noise, birds, wind, the creak of wood, the breath of a settling house. But once, just once, the rain stopped, for a minute. And in that minute, she smiled, because this time, the silence meant peace. Chapter 18. The closing remark. A month had passed since the final curtain fell at Rosemore Estate. The house no longer whispered secrets through the corridors. It exhaled now, as if relieved to be free of what it had carried for so long. Life had resumed, not in haste, but with a kind of tentative dignity. Quiet replantings in the garden, dust covers removed from once shuttered rooms, the chiming of the grandfather clock finally accurate again. Lady Helena had begun accepting callers once more, though she preferred brief visits and longer silences. James Ambrose had departed for the north, his letters to Helena courteous and sparse. Charlotte remained in custody, awaiting a sentence that now seemed inevitable, though not without complexity. Dr. Hartley had formally confessed and requested no defense. The courts, moved perhaps by the sheer plainness of his guilt, treated him with firm but dispassionate justice. But it was Beatrice Lockwood who changed most of all. Each morning she woke early and walked through the grounds, past the reflecting pool, down the overgrown orchard paths, and to the clearing just beyond the wood where Lord Rosemore's hounds once used to run. There, she would sit with a small lap desk and a thermos of tea, writing carefully and without haste. Her manuscript, titled The Rain That Stopped for 1 Minute, grew each day, less a case report and more a human study, 1 page at a time. Her dedication read simply, "To those who listen before they accuse, and to those who fear the wrong thing." Far from Rosemore, deep in London's fog-threaded neighborhoods, Hercule Poirot sat at a café on King's Road, sipping a perfectly warm tisane. Across from him, Inspector Laidlaw thumbed through a small folder of clippings, newspaper reports, court statements, and the faint buzz of public speculation surrounding the case. "They still call it a double crime," Laidlaw muttered. "Some say Charlotte was the true mastermind. Others say she was just as much a victim." Poirot gave a small, deliberate shrug. "Ah, but such debates. They belong to those who need tidy endings." He stirred his cup. "The truth, mon ami, is that most crimes are not born from hatred alone. They are born from bruised pride, unattended fear, and the slow erosion of self. Charlotte was not a murderer, but she taught someone else how to become one." Laidlaw sat back. "Do you think Hartley would have acted without her misdirection?" "No," Poirot said, "but she would never have acted without knowing someone else might. Their paths crossed not in a plan, but in vulnerability. That is the most dangerous kind of partnership." Laidlaw nodded thoughtfully. "And the girl? Beatrice?" Poirot smiled softly. "Ah, mademoiselle. She was the only one who never reached for power. That is why she will remember it all with clarity, because she never sought to alter it." The waiter brought their bill, and Poirot slipped a precise coin onto the tray. "La vérité," he said as he stood, "is not always hidden in the act. It is hidden in the choice to remain silent while another suffers." Laidlaw raised a brow. "And in this case, that silence broke more than one person." "Indeed," Poirot replied, "but it also revealed the rest." In her final entry of the manuscript, Beatrice wrote, "When the rain paused, everything else spoke louder, a clock, A glass, a breath held too long. But what I remember most was not the minute of silence. It was what came after, a man standing alone in a room full of voices, every lie exposed, every face revealed, and saying nothing until we were all ready to listen. He did not shout, he did not accuse, he arranged the truth like a chessboard, and we simply stepped into place. That is how justice came to Rosemoor, not with thunder, but with clarity. Far away, in a quiet flat in London, Poirot placed a fresh orchid in a glass vase, straightened a silver photo frame on his mantel, and poured a cup of coffee exactly to the halfway mark. He sat, folded open the morning paper, and allowed himself, just briefly, the smile of a man whose little grey cells had once again served the cause of order in a world inclined to disorder. And somewhere in the countryside, a summer house stood quiet, waiting not for rain, but for remembrance. Finn.